This is what we need as a culture. This is what we are missing. This is what we're longing for, which is stories, new ways of telling the ancient tales, new ways of telling the stories that mean something to the next generation. There's something powerful that happens when we go and sit in a movie theater together, when we get our popcorn and we share in the story, we go on the adventure together. Hey there, and welcome to The Golden Thread. So I have a movie-related question for you today, and that is, did you ever watch a movie? Can you remember maybe as a kid you saw a movie that you were really too young to be watching? I know for myself, I can immediately think of what that movie was, and that was, of course, Steven Spielberg's Jaws. And I was thinking about this because this past summer was actually the 50th anniversary of Jaws. And so it came back to theaters again, and my wife and I, of course, had to go and see it. And of course, if you're going to go and see Jaws back on the big screen, you have to go see it in 3D, of course. So we went and saw it in 3D, which was a lot of fun. It was really, really great. It was so awesome to see it back on the big screen. But I can remember, it reminded me of the very first time watching Jaws. And I was quite young at the time. I remember my parents threw it on. And I was probably around maybe 8 years old at the time, and we're watching this movie. And, when you're 8 years old, of course, you want to, prove to everybody that you're big enough to be able to watch, scary movies and stuff like this. And so I'm, of course, trying to be as tough as I could, as a little 8-year-old could be on the couch. And so I'm watching this movie, and I got about as far as there is a scene where there's a kid that gets attacked by the shark. And I can remember my parents looking over at me, and my face must have just been white, it must have just been really I was not selling it very well. All the color was drained, and I was just kind of, glazed over. And I remember my mom being like, okay, I think we're going to turn this off, which of course was the correct choice, because I definitely was too young for it. It was pretty scary for me, and it was really scary for a lot of people, because of course when this movie came out, it was scary enough that it scared people out of the water. People didn't want to go back in the water after having seen this movie Jaws, and it scared me enough to where I didn't go back to watch this again for quite some time until I was a teenager. And then I remember as a teenager, probably, I don't know, maybe 13, 14, 15, somewhere in there, I went back and I put the movie on and checked it out and was absolutely captivated by it. And Jaws has gone on to become one of my favorite films of all time. I really think it's, in some ways, it's like a perfect film, but it's a movie that it's like one of those movies that you have to watch it at the right time of life. You know what I mean? It really just kind of has to hit you. And I think maybe even as a teenager, it's almost that perfect kind of time, because in a lot of ways, the story of Jaws, and you might not think of it this way, but the story of Jaws, if you've ever seen it, or perhaps you haven't, in which case I would encourage you to check this movie out, watch the movie. It's a really incredible film, but one of the things that you might not necessarily think of with this movie, but I think is very much the case, is that Jaws in a lot of ways is a coming of age story. That's actually what it is. And so I actually think it's kind of almost a perfect movie to watch as a teenager, as you're growing up, because it is a coming of age story. Now, you might not think of it that way because the characters aren't kids. They're not particularly young. They're full-grown adult men, which we'll talk about. But it is still that same kind of story. It is about what it is for a boy to become a man, or for a man to become a hero. And I think that it speaks to that something inside of all of us that wants to rise, that wants to grow, that wants to become whatever that thing is. And so I think in a lot of ways, Jaws is that story. It is, in a lot of ways, Jaws is a story about what it is to rise to become a hero in the modern era. that's really what the story is. And I think that in a lot of ways, we need these kinds of stories more than ever in our culture, because there's sort of this question of how do we do that? Like, what is a hero? How do we become heroes? How do we rise? How do we learn? How do we grow? And I think in a lot of ways, we've sort of lost touch with some of the traditional sort of rites of passage that teach boys how to become men, or girls how to become women, or for adults to become heroes. And so we need these stories more than ever. And in a lot of ways, Jaws is that kind of story. It is the hero tale. It is the hero's journey of going out into the adventure and being transformed. In a lot of ways, Jaws is the quintessential monster myth. There are these great stories throughout history. You can think about what they are. The stories of, Theseus and the Minotaur, and there's stories about Jack and the Giant, and George and the Dragon, all of these kinds of stories where you have the hero that has to battle against the monster. And to tie this in a little bit with what we've been talking about, we've been talking recently about the Iliad, and we alluded a little bit to the Odyssey and this idea of ships and these kinds of nautical tales of ships. And we talked a little bit about the idea that the Iliad offers about becoming unified against a common adversary. And that is what the monster story is. That's what the monster myth is. It presents us with this almost larger than life adversary that can bring us all together. And there's it speaks to something deep inside of us that wants to be able to come together, to be transformed in the process of doing battle with the monster. And so that's what we see with the story of Jaws. And when we look at these kinds of monster stories, when we think about what these kinds of monster stories are teaching us about ourselves and about the world in which we live, the most important thing, and the kind of the sort of, if you will, sort of the common thread, we have been thinking about this idea of a common thread that runs through all of stories. One of the really main common threads that runs through these kinds of monster stories is the idea that even though in the story there is a monster, right? So whether it's a dragon or a giant or, an alien, creature of some kind, or whatever it is, or it might even be a psychological monster of some kind, and all these kinds of things in horror stories perhaps. But whatever the monster looks like, what monster stories ultimately teach us is about ourselves, that the monster is sort of an outward reflection of things that are within us. The monster is not this external thing, the monster is the external representation of what is within us, and how do we overcome the monsters within. And the way in which we do battle with the monster is going to determine how we do that. Are we going to be able to do that? And we see this in the movie, in the story of Jaws, from the very first scene. So in the very first scene, and I'm going to talk about the movie a little bit here with you today, and I will try not to spoil things too much in case there's listeners that maybe haven't seen the movie, which I hope you will. This will inspire you perhaps to go and watch it. Or if you have seen it before, I hope it will inspire you to watch the movie again, because it is such a great film. But I'm going to just kind of generally paint for you some of the ideas in the film and hopefully not spoil things too much. But at the very beginning of the film, there is a shark attack. Spoiler alert, this is a movie about a shark. So there's a shark attack, and it's one of the most iconic scenes in any movie of this kind ever, and maybe any movie ever. But it is this attack that happens at night, and there's a girl who's out swimming. It's on the poster, the famous poster with the shark coming up underneath. And so she's out swimming, and the shark comes and attacks her, and it's a very scary scene. And then it leads us into all of the adventure and everything else that comes afterward. But what's so significant about the scene that I want to just spend a little bit of time talking about here is the way in which the shark attack happens. Because the significance of this is that the way in which the girl ends up in the water in the first place. And the idea here is that there is a party going on at the beach, and it's a bunch of young people. They're hanging out, and there's this young man in particular who looks across the fire at her, and you can tell that he has no doubt been drinking. He's looking a little, hazy, and so he is under the influence. Okay, so this young man who's kind of come under the influence, and then he sees this pretty girl across the fire, and so he kind of, gives her the wink, gives her the side eye, and says, "Hey, why don't you come over here with me?" And they end up running down the beach, and so she ends up going into the water, and we know what happens as a result of this. But what's significant about this scene is, first of all, that the shark comes later. The first thing that we see happen is we see, in this case, this young man who is under the influence of alcohol, and he is giving in, therefore then to, his inhibitions have been dropped a bit, and maybe her inhibitions have been dropped a bit as well. And so next thing you know, we've got, this kind of sexual attraction going on where he sees this pretty girl, and the next thing you know, they're going off down the beach. And so the first thing that we see is here a character, a young man who is giving into, or has been, you could say, overwhelmed by, who is under the influence of these kinds of primal instincts, these kinds of inner powers, these urges, these things, whether they are, in this case, the drinking, or whether it's the sexual urge, or whatever these kinds of things might be, he has come under the influence. And so his better judgment has been sort of pushed aside, and he's just going with his gut, right? He's just acting out of his pure instinct. And this is what the story is about, because it's significant that the monster in the story is a shark. The idea of a very ancient creature that goes way, way back into the primordial past and awakens these kinds of primal fears inside of us. There's a scene that happens a little bit later on where there's a famous quote, which is something to the effect of, you yell barracuda and everybody says, "Oh, what?" And then nobody's fazed. But if you yell shark, all of a sudden you've got a panic on your hands. And why is that, right? Like, there's this idea that there are certain images, there's certain things that go back to childhood, that maybe even go back to the childhood of the human race, right? That we go back to primordial, these kind of primordial ancient instincts that we have that can overwhelm us, that can overpower us. Those are the monsters. It's not this animal, right? It's not really the shark that is sort of the obvious thing, but it's the fact that we can succumb to fear, that we can succumb to desire, that we can succumb to exhaustion, we can succumb to panic, all of these different kinds of psychological states that they can overwhelm and overpower us. And that's what happens to the young man. And then he, by extension, is exerts that influence on this young woman, and so he then draws her away. So in a sense, he then becomes the monster. And it's not because, and again, not to be too hard on this particular character, it's not like he has any kind of evil or murderous intent, right? He's just this, young guy who, makes some bad choices. But in the story, he plays the role of kind of luring her out away from the fire, out into the darkness. She ends up in the water, and she ends up getting killed. And it's so interesting because when this happens, when the shark is attacking her, when this is going on and she's in the water, the camera keeps panning back to the beach, and it pans back to the young man, and the young man is sprawled out on the beach, just sort of kind of unconscious or semi-conscious, sort of giggling to himself, right? So he's fully under the influence of whatever he's been doing, and he's just sprawled out there on the beach, and the camera keeps panning back and forth to this girl who's in the water, and there's this like call to us, there's this desire, there's this urgency of like of this call to the young man, like, do something, like, get up, like, what are you doing? Are you, like go for help? I mean, or do something, right? We're not sure what he could do, but he's got to do something. And so there's this invitation that's sort of implicit in the story that there are these kinds of inner things that can overwhelm us, that can cause us to succumb, that can pull us down, that can consume us if we're not careful, but that in those kinds of experiences, even in those moments, there is an opportunity for us to rise to the call to heroism. There's this call to to become the hero, to do what is needed, to, even as they are kind of out in the darkness or out on the ocean, sort of away from the firelight, away from safety, there is still this moment where he could rise to this call, but instead he's sort of succumbs. There's an aspect of this too that involves us as the viewer, which is really fascinating. And that is that while the girl is in the water, so as they go off together, she ends up going into the water, and the implication is that she's naked, right? So she's skinny dipping in the ocean, which of course, if you're watching this as, a 13 or 14-year-old kid, that's all very exciting, right? So it's like, hey, there's, we're 5 minutes into this movie and there's like, hey, there's a girl in the water and she's not wearing anything. And so you start watching a little bit more closely, and there's that aspect to it. But what happens here, and this is really significant, what happens here is then the camera begins to take on the point of view of the shark. We become the shark. And as the shark is getting closer, this is before she gets attacked, as the shark is getting closer and closer to the girl and she's in the water, we see the silhouette of her in the water. And of course, it's dark, we can't make anything out too much, but we're getting closer and closer and closer. And there is this implication, there's this little bit of a sense as you're watching this of almost like a little bit of a voyeurism. There's a little bit of a sense of us taking on almost a kind of predatory perspective a little bit here, right? Like we are in the shark's POV and we're getting closer and it's like, oh, well, there's this naked girl and we're kind of looking and we're getting closer and closer. And then suddenly the shark attacks and it's horrific. But there's almost this little bit of a slightly guilty feeling that you get from this of like, we were the shark. We were the predator for a moment there. There's this sense of like, oh, is the monster actually the shark? Or is it the young man on the beach? Or is it us on the couch? It's like, what role do we play? And it invites us sort of uncomfortably into that. We get uncomfortably close of like, oh, are there actually these kinds of potentially monstrous instincts inside of each of us that if we don't control them, if we don't have the power, if we don't take responsibility for ourselves and grow and have that kind of maturity, if we don't actually come of age in that sense, and we don't just mean here getting older, but like even as an adult watching this movie, there's that sort of like titillating thing that like awakens that like 12-year-old boy of like, oh, look at the girl on the screen, kind of a thing, right? Because it speaks to that sort of just basic kind of instinct that we have all inside of us. And there's this call to maturity. It's this call to come of age, this call to rise to heroism, to be more than that, to not be simply mastered by our own passions or our own inclinations. And whether or not we will be able to do that determines the role that we will play in the story of our lives. This idea of, will I be merely a bystander or perhaps even a victim or even a monster, right? Would I even take on the role of the monster, or will I become the hero? Will I be able to overcome those things, overcome the fear, overcome the desires, overcome all of these instincts and actually be more than that? And like that in a nutshell is what the story is. And I think that this is the kind of story that we need so much, even in our culture today. We need stories that teach us how to become heroes. And so we now come to the main character. And so this introduces us to the main character of the story, which is the police chief Brody. Police Chief Brody is the character that we follow for most of the story here. And he's a really interesting character because we don't actually know all that much about him. So he is the police chief of this, serving on this island, which is called Amity Island, which means friendship. But he's on this Amity Island and he's the police chief. And we get this sort of implication from this that he is running away from something. Again, we don't know much about him, which is good because it enables us to actually inhabit him. We become that character, right? So he becomes sort of the surrogate that we would adopt, and we become that character, and we see things through his eyes. But we do get little sort of hints as to who Brody is, and it's the sense that he was like perhaps like a New York City cop and had done that for some time, and for whatever reason he leaves, and he's kind of like running away. You know what I mean? So it's like he's kind of gone off to this little idyllic island community where he is living with his family And it's like he just wants to get away. He just wants to rest. He just wants to escape. And we don't really know what it is that he's running from. It's perhaps it's responsibility, or perhaps there's something traumatic maybe that happened, in his past, or maybe it's something that he even fears about himself. We don't entirely know, but he's running away to some degree to this place where he thinks he can just kind of escape and get some rest. And there's even a little bit of there's a little bit of a hint here of the biblical story of Jonah, if you're familiar with that story, where this character of Jonah, this character is called by God to go and do this difficult task, and of course he runs away and boards a ship and ends up inside of a fish or a whale, right? So there's a little bit of, and that story, of course, is about how how you can't run from your calling. Well, you can, but sooner or later, it will catch up with you. And it's the same for Brody, that he is running essentially from what it is, the call to heroism, to become this kind of hero. And so he, for a long time in the story, he kind of runs away and he's looking for other people to be the hero instead. So one of the characters that he looks to is the mayor, and the mayor of the island is this wonderfully sleazy character. He's so great, but he is this kind of great example of this idea, again, of somebody who ought to be a hero. He ought to be a heroic character. He ought to be, in some ways, a father figure, not just to his own family, but to his community as well. He's supposed to be the one that exemplifies this kind of responsibility. And yet he doesn't. The mayor, time and time again, abdicates his responsibility. He makes bad choices because, why? Because he comes under the influence of his own desire, which is the classic pitfall of the politician, which is the desire for popularity, right? He wants people to love him. He wants to be, the mayor, the fun mayor that everybody loves. And so he doesn't want to close the beaches. But Brody, tries to get him to, but he won't do it. And so then they talk to the townspeople. So again, Brody's like, okay, well, he won't be the hero. So let's go to the townspeople. Maybe we can get them. But they won't do it either, because they have succumbed to their own instincts as well, which is, you could say it's kind of almost their survival instinct, but it's their desire for material wealth. They know that having the beaches open is what is going to provide them with a prosperous season. And so they're like, no, we can't close the beaches. So ultimately it's greed, right, for them. So there's this desire for money, for wealth, for financial security. And so they give in to that. And so once again, Brody kicks the ball kind of down the field. And then even further along, after things start to happen and the shark starts to attack, then there's all the fishermen, right? Then the fishermen are going to go out and they're going to go out and catch the shark, except that they are kind of giving into panic. And so they are kind of, they're bumping into each other, and there's guns going off, and ships, boats are almost capsizing, and someone throws a, stick of dynamite into the water, and it's just chaos. It's this kind of like Lord of the Flies type of a situation. Because again, they're coming under their influence of fear and panic and maybe bloodlust, right? Like we gotta kill the beast, this sort of mob kind of mentality. And so the second point that I think that we can learn from the story of Jaws, as we're thinking about this idea of the heroic tale, is that you cannot simply look to other people to be the heroes. That you can't look to others to be the hero. But at some point, you instead yourself have to learn. We have to learn to choose to take the heroic path. The call is to us. And fortunately in this, Brody isn't alone. There are several other characters that come alongside him. There's these other two. So there are three characters altogether, and they are Brody, and then there's this character Hooper, played by Richard Dreyfuss, and then this character of Quint, played by Robert Shaw, and Brody is played by Roy Scheider. Great performances by all three of these characters, but in a lot of ways, these three characters are essentially, they are kind of the same hero. They are almost like the three faces of the hero at different stages of life. So Brody, obviously, he's kind of the middle-aged one. He's the one who's sort of, he's kind of in some ways having sort of a midlife crisis. He's going through this. at this time of his life. And then, but there are these other two characters, and those characters are Hooper, who is sort of youth, and then there is Quint, who is essentially he's like old age, right? And so you see that the character of Quint comes along first, and he's this old, sort of grizzled fisherman, and he wants to go off and kill the shark. But the problem is nobody likes Quint because he's essentially become old and jaded and crusty, and he just nobody he doesn't connect with the community anymore because he's sort of withdrawn into himself. He's kind of like, he's scarred, and he's sort of sardonic and a little bit belligerent. He's kind of like the old man of the sea, you know? He's like that quintessential kind of character. And for him, like, his struggle is that he's become inflexible with old age, and he doesn't know how to adapt to changing times. And the world is sort of changing around him, but he hasn't changed, and he doesn't want to change. And so he's kind of disconnected, and he has sort of like this scorn for those that are younger than him. And so he kind of represents this sort of like aged, dogged, holding on to tradition, but not passing it on to the next generation. And Quint's story is that that has to change in him. Like, he has to learn how to pass it on. He has to learn how to come in many ways face to face with death himself and be willing to pass on what he has learned to the next generation. And so that is something that I think from the story that we can learn as well, is that we ourselves need to learn to adapt to an ever-changing world and be willing to pass on what we have learned to the next generation. And we need to do this both individually in our lives, personally, and we need to learn to do this as a culture, that we need to be able to pass on what was passed down to us to the next generation. That's how civilization continues. That's how culture continues. And I think that that is one of the things that we're seeing break down in our culture in this kind of generational divide. It's always there, right? There's that like generation gap where, it's how do we cross that? Are we going to be able to pass the torch? Are we going to be able to hand it off? And we'll talk more about this here, but this idea that Quint hasn't figured out how to do that yet, right? Like he's not passed it on, but he's got to learn to do that. And then we have youth. We have sort of the future, which is sort of represented by this character of Hooper, who is, as we said, played by Richard Dreyfuss so wonderfully. And he is this young, enthusiastic, young guy who's very, very smart, and he's very well educated, and he's rich. He's got lots of money, and he's got a boat, and he has all this equipment. In a lot of ways, again, he represents the future. He's the man of science, right? So if Quint is sort of like the man of tradition, the old fisherman, like the old way of doing things, Hooper represents the future. He represents what is yet ahead. And so he brings that to the table, and he brings that to the expedition. But the problem with Hooper and what he has to learn to overcome is that Hooper is arrogant, right? He has this kind of arrogance. He has this invincibility about him. It's that like invincibility of youth of like, oh yeah, I just love sharks. Like, I'm not afraid of sharks. I'll just jump right in the water. Like, so he has this kind of recklessness almost to him. And he is, and he's kind of scornful of Quint, right? Quint is dismissive of him, and Hooper in return is kind of scornful of Quint. And there's a little bit of a sense also of an aspect of even this story is one that deals a lot with trauma, right? Brody is it's sort of implied that maybe Brody has had some traumatic experiences that he's running from. Quint, we come to learn, has had some traumatic experiences. We get a little bit of a sense that maybe Hooper has had some somewhat traumatic experiences as a kid as well, because of the way in which he responds to Quint and the way in which he responds to the older fishermen, which is that as they're kind of pushing him around a little bit, he's kind of geeky, and they're pushing him around and saying, oh, your hands are soft, you don't know how to tie a knot, all this kind of stuff, this macho sort of thing. And he reacts by like becoming almost like a kid. He like starts making faces at them, and he like lashes out, and it's almost like, oh, he's reverting back to like maybe when he was a kid, when he was this maybe dorky science kind of nerd, and he was getting pushed around on the playground, or the bullies were at him. And so it's kind of this idea that like we carry those things inside of us, and they continue to affect us even as we get older. But Hooper's primary struggle is one of humility. It's that he has to learn to have the humility to learn from those who have gone before. And we also need to learn to to receive from those who have gone before us, and to in that realize that we're not invincible, right? We don't have all the answers that even youth or the future or science or all of these kinds of things, like, they're not going to protect us from everything. There are things from the past that we need to receive, that need to be passed down to us. It's not just all about the future, nor is it all about the past. We need actually both of these things, and that's where Brody comes in, right? Brody is the one who is in the middle. He's the one who is like Dante, right? In Dante's Inferno, midway along the journey of his life, who wanders into the dark wood, and he finds himself in the dark wood because he's wandered from the straight way. This is kind of what Brody is, right? So he is in this sort of dark wood in between, and he's kind of caught between these two worlds. And as we say, he's been kind of looking to others to be the hero. He's looking to this one, looking to that one, and he doesn't want to do it himself. But he has to actually learn that he is essential. He is vital because he's the one that holds these two sides together. That he is the one who joins together the past and the future, and he's needed for that reason. And so, and you can see in him aspects of both of these characters. Like, you can see in him, there's sort of like the smoldering embers of the kind of enthusiasm that Hooper has, right? The sense that Hooper is always, he's like, yeah, let's go out there and let's, he's like, I love sharks, But Brody has this kind of, you see it like a sense of like that Brody at one point or another in his life wanted to make a difference. Like that's probably why he went into law enforcement. It's like he wanted to be a hero. He wanted to do things. He wanted to make a difference in the world. And we're not sure why, but he's become more like Quint. He's become jaded. He's lost faith in humanity. He's lost faith in himself. Maybe he's had encounters with monsters in the world, and maybe in his experience, maybe he's had encounters with monsters in himself. There's a scene a little bit later on where Brody picks up a pistol, and it's the first time that we see him pick up a pistol, and it's a big moment for him because it almost seems to imply that he's afraid of his own power. He's afraid of taking responsibility. He's afraid of what he might actually be capable of doing. Right? And so it's like he doesn't want to take the weapon. He doesn't want to take up the sword. He doesn't want to go into battle himself because he's a little bit afraid. So he's letting other people do that. But he has to learn that he is the one who has to do that. He's the one who has to bring these two worlds together. And I think that for us as well, that as we are taking on the role of Brody, we need to be ones who are willing to take responsibility ourselves and not always be looking to others, not looking necessarily to just, the people, on the scientific side, right, with the future, and say, hey, okay, we're going to look to science, or looking to those in the past with, say the traditional side of things, and be like, okay, we ourselves, we are the heroes, right? We are the ones that are engaging with the world. And so we have to learn to not just abdicate and give it to other people, but to take responsibility and to rise and fight the monsters ourselves. And so that's one of the main things that we see. And so the three of them together, they join together, and there's this wonderful scene where, of course, they get on the boat and they sail out to sea. And as they're sailing out to sea, we kind of see there's this great shot where they sail like into the jaws of death. There's this like shark's mouth where they kind of sail out into the sea, and that's where they undergo transformation out on the sea in this kind of third act of the story. And it's the same for us, that as we go out and we engage with the adventure, and we stop running away, and we stop trying to hide, and we stop giving into fear, that's when we can begin to change. That's when we can begin to be transformed. But it can't happen in isolation. The three of them are required. You see, we can't just be trying to always be the hero ourselves. We need each other. We need to lean on one another. And there's this transformation that happens where at first, as they're out there on the boat and they're doing battle with the shark and all these kinds of things, they don't get along with each other, right? Because they're all different and they're all seeing things from different places. In fact, they kind of rub each other the wrong way, and things get from bad to worse, and it's just one disaster after another. And they have to learn how to work together. But how do they do it? How do they overcome the differences? And this is the question for us as well. Like, how do we overcome our differences as a culture? How do we overcome our differences even in our own lives individually? How can we actually be bonded together and work together? And there's this powerful scene. I think it's it's the emotional heart of the entire story, where there's this moment where they're weary from the battle, and they're sitting in the cabin of the boat out in the sea, and it's out at sea, and it's night. And they all begin to kind of loosen up and begin to swap kind of fish stories with one another. And then the next thing you know, they start to compare scars with each other. It's this very like male bonding, kind of like macho thing where they're like, well, let me show you how big, my scar is, And so they're going back and forth like this, and they're swapping scars. And it's very funny and it's kind of goofy. But then a really deep, powerful thing happens in the midst of the scene, that as they're warming up to each other and as they're sharing these stories with one another, Quint opens up and he tells them a story about something real and traumatic that happened in his life that maybe he's never told anybody about. And I won't go into it. You can watch it in the movie, but he tells this story about this deep trauma, this terrible experience that he has had, that he's been carrying around with him. And the other two get quiet and they listen as he shares and he pours this out. And there's this moment of bonding that happens, that in the swapping of fish stories, in the sharing of scars with one another, he's able to open up and unburden himself of this trauma that he's been carrying around inside of himself all of these years, which has probably been the obstacle, probably one of the reasons why he hasn't been able to connect and hasn't been able to integrate. And so he's able to open up. And so from this scene, I think we can learn this point, which is that in order to work together to overcome the monsters that we face, we need to learn how to share our scars with one another. That is such a profound idea. The idea that we need to be vulnerable enough to share what the things are that we're afraid of, what the things are that have hurt us, that we have experienced in that way. That's the way in which we bond. That's the way in which we overcome the differences. We start to realize, oh yeah, we can begin to become vulnerable with each other. But that's not all, because what's actually really fascinating in this scene is that's not the end of the scene. It's almost like that's the beginning of the bonding, but that's not enough. It has to go a little bit further, because after he tells, this story about what happened to him, the other two get really quiet because they don't know what to say. Like, they're like, oh my gosh, like he just opened up and told us this story and nobody else can compare with this story. Like, nobody has a scar that's that deep or that brutal. And so nobody can really relate to what Quint is saying. And so there's a breakdown there, and there's this moment of like, what's going to happen? And then Quint, this is so cool, Quint begins to sing a song. And it's this song that Quint has been singing this entire time, all throughout the story. And it's this old seafaring ballad, farewell and adieu to you fair Spanish ladies. And it's this kind of like old-timey sort of, farewell or lament. And it's almost like a song that he seems to like sing to comfort himself almost in a little bit. And it's almost like there's an invitation to the other two to start singing with him, to share the song. Except here's the problem. They don't know the words. They don't know the song. This is an old song. This is a song that Quint knows because he's been singing it all his life, but they don't know it. This is a song from before their time. And so there's this like awkward silence. And I believe that to tie this in with our own culture and our own experiences today, that this is exactly what we're experiencing as a culture, that this is one of the things that we're struggling with, which is that and one of the reasons why we're struggling to be able to bond with one another, to be able to relate with one another, and why the generations are struggling to be able to remain connected with one another is because there's a generation that doesn't know the song that those that came before them are singing. We've lost the thread of the stories that meant something to the older generations no longer seem to mean the same things to the younger generations. And so the handoff isn't happening. It's like, I don't understand, sometimes people will try to share some of those things. We'll try to share some of the stories with those that are younger. And yet there's like a language barrier. There's a breakdown. There's like, I don't get what you're trying to say. Like, I don't understand, these old books. I don't understand, what you're telling me about Shakespeare. I don't understand what you're telling me about Milton. I don't quite understand what, this biblical story means, or what Homer, means, or these kinds of things. It's like, how do we connect? Like, where are these things happening? And so there's a breakdown there, and there's an opportunity, there's this possibility that could be the end of the story. Like, that could be it. But there's also an opportunity there. There's an opportunity to make that connection. And the question is, how do we do it? And Jaws has the answer. Jaws has the answer. What is the answer? The answer is provided by Hooper. As they're sitting there, Hooper begins to sing a different song. And the song that he sings is a simpler song than the one that Quint sings. It seems almost like it's simple by comparison. It's almost kind of juvenile. It's a little bit, maybe a slightly goofier kind of ballad, but it's a similar enough song where it's really basically the same song. And the song that he sings is "Show Me the Way to Go Home. I'm tired and I want to go to bed. I had a little drink about an hour ago and it went straight to my head. Wherever I may roam, by land or sea or foam, you will always hear me singing this song. Show me the way to go home." And it's almost like, again, this song, it's the same basic idea. There's almost like a confession in the song. I had a little drink, right, about an hour ago. I've come under the influence. I'm not invincible. There's a humility to that, right? But I'm still here. I'm still in the adventure. I'm still out at sea. I'm still on the journey, still trying to become the hero, right? And wherever I may roam, you'll still hear me singing, but I need help. I need someone to show me the way. And as he's singing this song, then Brody and Quint begin to sing it with him. And on their part, there's a humility that's required there, which is the sense of, hey, this is kind of a goofy song. It's not as antiquated. It's not as ornate or as embellished as the song that Quint was singing. He has to be willing to give up the song that he's been singing his whole life and sing the song of the next generation. Be able to change the words a little bit. Be like, okay, maybe it's not, I don't love this song as much as the song that I used to sing, as the thing that it spoke to me when I was a kid. But you know what? I'll meet you there. I'll meet you halfway. I'll meet you where in the midst of the story and the song that you understand, that means something to you. And that's where they bond, and they all sing the song together. And that's the moment where they come together. And this is what we need as a culture. This is what we are missing. This is what we're longing for, which is stories, new ways of telling the ancient tales, new ways of telling the stories that mean something to the next generation, that we can all bond together. And we have to find new ways. We have to find ways of adapting and changing, and sometimes even simplifying things down a little bit so that we can still come together. And there's something powerful that happens when we come together to share a story, because that's what Jaws is. Jaws is the ancient story. It is the ancient myth. It is the same story told in a simpler, kind of more modern way, but it's the same story. And there's something powerful that happens when we go and sit in a movie theater together, and we get our popcorn and we share in the story. We go on the adventure together, right? Or we get up or we get on the couch together. Whatever it is, we need to be able to share these kinds of stories. And so we need storytellers to tell these kinds of stories, but we also need to find the stories, and we need to find the meaning and find the ancient meaning that is in these stories so that we can begin to connect with one another, even across the generations. That's so powerful. And so that is, again, one of the themes here is that we have to be willing to adapt and to be able to sing the song together in that way. There is one last thought that I want to just share with you here, and I'm going to just share one last thought with you from the ending of the story. And I'm going to keep it a little vague because I don't want to spoil the ending for anybody who hasn't maybe seen the film. But the way the story ends is so cool. Like, it's such an amazing ending to the story. And it's interesting because it ends in kind of a somewhat outlandish way. There's a somewhat outlandish thing that happens. There's kind of a stroke of luck, and something happens. And people, when Spielberg was making the film, people criticized him. They said, don't do it. Don't do it, Steven. Like, you shouldn't do it this way, because audiences won't buy it. They won't go with it. It's too outlandish. It's too over the top. It's too ridiculous. But Spielberg pushed back on them, and he said, no. This is the way the story has to end. This is how it has to be. And he said, if we've done our job right, if we've told the story correctly, audiences, we've got them. Like, audiences will be bought in. They will go with us. They will believe it. And he was absolutely right, because the way that the story ends is the way the story needs to end. And the final lesson of the story is this, is that at the end of the day, the future is important and the past is important. We need, we need the future. We need science. We need innovation, all of those kinds of things. We also need the past, right? We need tradition, and we need what came before us, and we need those kinds of things as well. But at the end, neither one of those things is able to actually defeat the monster completely. The shark cage, in the water, the ship, the old fishing boat, right? The shark cage, the future, science, the old fishing boat, the past, tradition, they break, right? Like they can't actually do it. They can't actually defeat the monster. At the end of the day, the only thing that can defeat the monster is courage. And that is something that it's such a simple idea, but I think that it's an idea that we resonate with deep down inside of us, because this is what stories have always been telling us. This is what the great myths have always been telling us, which is that at the end of the day, it is when we choose to face the monster, when we choose to stand up against the monsters and overcome our own fear and our own weaknesses, and that is when help or luck or aid or divine intervention, whatever you want to call it, that's when that will come to us. That we ourselves don't just do it on our own. We show up with courage in the face of even sometimes impossible odds. There are experiences in our lives where we can say, it doesn't even make sense to show up, because how could we possibly stand against this, right? Or in our culture where things seem so overwhelming. But this is where we have to look to the ancient tales, where they have told us always that when we choose to stand up and face these things with courage, that's when help will come. That's when the J.R.R. Tolkien's eucatastrophe, the transformation from darkness into light, that's when that moment can happen. And we need to learn to believe that again. Like, we need to actually learn to believe that, because as a culture, we've become like Quint. We've become jaded. We've become cynical. We've lost belief in a lot of ways in the idea of divine intervention or luck or whatever you want to call it, whatever that means to you. It's like we feel like we're in this alone. We're in the boat alone. We've got to just do everything ourselves. But that's not what the stories tell us. What the stories teach us is that you've got to learn to show up with courage, even when it doesn't make sense. That we need to learn to rise and become the hero and take a stand wherever that is in our lives. And if we do that and we take a stand against the monsters and against even the things inside of ourselves, right? That is where aid will come, even when it's unlooked for, even when we just can't imagine that things could go from the worst to anything better. But this is what the story teaches us, and this is what we need to learn to believe again, because that's the only way that we'll be able to go forward. That is the only way that we can continue on. That is how humanity has come this far, is to not give in to fear, to not give in to despair, because that's death. That's the end. We have to have courage even in the face of darkness and even in the face of fear itself. And so that's really kind of the final thought that I want to leave you with. And there is just one last thing, which is that at the very, very end, the last sentiment, and this is so cool, the last sentiment in the movie is this: that as scary of a movie as Jaws is, and as traumatic in many times as the experiences that we go through are, and that the characters go through in the story, the last sentiment of the story is the characters look at one another and they express to one another that they're not afraid anymore. And that is true for us, that as we experience, as we go through these kinds of experiences, even putting ourselves through watching a movie like Jaws, whatever it might be, maybe a scary movie, we ourselves undergo transformation, that we learn how to overcome fear. And even in our experiences in our life, that there's a way, there's a posture, there's a manner of being in the world that can enable us to go through these experiences and not simply be destroyed by them, but rather to be transformed and to become the hero and to rise to the potential of all that we can be. And I think that is what the story of Jaws teaches us. And so I want to leave you with an invitation, and that that is an invitation to take a trip to Amity Island. Go watch Jaws, right? Whether it's for the first time or whether it's for, countless times of watching it, why don't you go watch Jaws and then share in the comments what was your experience with the movie? What were some thoughts, maybe some things that came to mind for you? And also, if you want to share a little bit too, we talked about the idea of sharing the scars, right? Sharing the experiences, the fears, the things that we've gone through in our lives that have made us who we are. And what were some of the ways in which you found the courage to face those things? In what ways have you found telling the stories, singing the song? How have you found that to be helpful in being able to overcome those things, to be able to overcome some of the inner monsters or some of the monsters that we face in the external world? And so I'm excited to hear from you in that. And so once again, I just want to invite you to continue to tell the stories, to continue to sing the songs with one another that continue to show us the way to go home. And so I look forward to getting to talk with you more, and I look forward to seeing you again in the next episode.